Hello and welcome to Maltbox, the non-chill filtered whiskey blog. I'm Andy and this is Whiskey Review 119. Now, what I have for you today is something quite interesting. It's a type of whiskey that I've not actually reviewed on the channel yet, which now I come to think of it, is quite unusual. It's also a very widely available whiskey. You can find it across supermarket shelves, in corner shops, whatever kind of shop you want to think of, nationwide. It's also, suppose you could describe it as the little brother of possibly one of the most controversial whiskey releases in recent years, or certainly one of the most promiscuous whiskey releases of recent years that drew quite a lot of media attention. That whiskey is this. Oh yes. It's the Haig Club Clubman single grain Scotch whisky. And what a mouthful that is. And there it is, guys, all its blue bottled glory, which I'm hoping, now I see it in the light, isn't too covered in fingerprints. Do apologise. I've got to say, right, I know it's got its critics for its branding, but I do find it quite fetching. I do quite like the sort of like side, the design of the bottle and the copper top. So, guys, first things first. This cost me a whopping £16 in Morrison's. You can find it for 15 quid on Amazon quite regularly. Its RRP should be £27.99. However, you'll never see it for £27.99 in any ordinary shop because it's basically a mass-produced bottling. I will get onto that in a little minute. All right, so what I'm going to do first is pour some. So, this is a full-size bottle. It's not a 50 centilitre bottle. It is a 70 centilitre bottle. It might look a little bit smaller. It's just a little bit wider, a little bit squatter. So, first things first, this is not a single malt Scotch whisky. This is not single malt. This is a single grain. There's quite a few differences between single malt and single grain. I'm going to go over them, but I'm going to go over them very briefly and very simply. So, single malt Scotch whisky has to be produced at a single distillery, hence the name. That's what the single stands for. And it must be made of 100% malted barley. All right? Single grain, again, the single word there, single distillery. However, it does not have to be made using malted barley. The predominant components will be malted barley. However, you can then put any other type of grain in within reason that you want. So, for example, a lot of them are made using barley and wheat, or barley and rye, barley and corn, barley, corn and rye, barley, wheat and corn. You know, there's various examples as to how you can make up your mash bill when it comes to single grain. Right. Now, the production process is much faster as well to make single grain, or grain whisky in general, should I say. That's because the type of still that you will use is different to the type of still that you will use for your single malt. So, for example, your single malt still will be a very traditional copper still. You know, the one that looks like a little onion bulb and it's got your swan neck. For grain, this type of still that is used is a column still or a coffee still, and that is literally two big columns, and there are varying plates in those columns at varying times. And what that basically does, it creates a continuous flow. So basically, as your alcoholic content continues to grow within the still, and it goes up and up through the different levels of plates, it comes off the still much faster than a pot still. And it also comes off the still at a much higher alcohol percentage. For example, usually, and this is just a usual sort of rough guide, whiskey that will come off a malt still, so pot still, so single malt, will usually run off the still around between 70 and 75% as a rule of thumb. That's not all distilleries because there's varying factors as to, you know, the percentage that it will come off the still. Grain, on the other hand, can come off the still at say 90%. 90% ABV, that will come off the still. 92, could be 93. It's high. It's completely different distillation process. Now, that aside, I appreciate that was quite a lot of information to take in. This is bottled at 40%. So we're talking that it comes off the still at 90 odd. It's been watered down to 40%, which is pretty, I'd say standard, but it depends on the type of bottlings and distilleries that you buy from. 40% is the bare minimum percentage that a whiskey has to be in order to be labelled as Scotch. You cannot bottle a Scotch whiskey at 37.5%, like you will see some rums, some vodkas, some gins. The SWA, the Scotch Whisky Association, who's the regulatory body for Scotch whisky, dictate to all distilleries across the entire country that whisky has to be bottled at 40% as a minimum. You will see bottles at 43, 46, 50%, cask strength in the 60% levels. However, this is a popular, widely available, mass-produced bottling, so 40% is kind of bang average, to be honest with you. It's to be expected. This has been matured in ex-bourbon casks. So, in the American whiskey industry, in the bourbon industry, they have to use brand new casks. And when those casks have been used, they are not allowed to use them again. So Scotch whisky distilleries go, fantastic. That is a source of whiskey casks right there that I can mature all of my spirit in. And as you can imagine, grain distilleries pump out a lot more whiskey than malt distilleries do. Malt distilleries use ex-bourbon barrels as well. It happens to be one of my favourite maturation types because, generally speaking, ex-bourbon casks, particularly refill, give you a bit of an insight as to the actual spirit's character without the influence of too much wood. So this has basically been matured in ex-bourbon casks that have been shipped over from America. They might not be first fill. I very much doubt they are first fill, which means that as soon as they get to Scotland, they are pumped full of whiskey. I suspect this will be second or third fill, so refill ex-bourbon casks, I suspect. So I'm trying to see if there's any more information on the back. There's not. I mean, it's telling me all about the smooth taste and things like that, which, firstly, if you're here and you're new to whiskey, you know, thanks for choosing the channel, first of all, and thank you for choosing this video. Smooth is a word that you should take with a pinch of salt, because smooth doesn't necessarily mean good. It doesn't necessarily mean enjoyment, and it might not even be as smooth as you expect. Grain whiskey, and I'm not going to go on for too much longer, don't worry. Grain whiskey, particularly when it's younger, which this will be because it is a no age statement whiskey. There is no age on the bottle. It's not 10 years old, it's not 12 years old, or I certainly don't think it is. Young grain whiskey tends to be a bit more immature than malt whiskey of the same age. It might sound stupid me saying that a 6-year-old malt whiskey is more mature than a 6-year-old grain whiskey, but that is down to how that whiskey drinks, how it tastes, how it smells. Malt tends to come on and age a little bit better, a little bit quicker. Grain whiskey tends to stay quite youthful for a number of years, even decades in some cases. However, it's very affordable because it's very easy to produce. It's widely available. Without further ado, guys, I'm going to go on to tasting this whiskey for you. Now, this is not going to be natural colour. Now, that means that this whiskey has had E150 caramel colour added to it. E150 is an E additive that you may have heard of, because if you look on the back of a Coke can or a Pepsi can, you will see that there is an E number on there, and that's E150. And that is the food-driven E number, the colorant that will give whiskey some colour. It only takes a drop a bottle, sometimes 2 drops, sometimes 3 drops, but it is added. It's there to make whiskey look old, look rich, etc. Many distillers do it. It's not a new thing. Dalmore, for example, pump their bottlings full of E150 colouring. So I'm not going to focus too much on the colour because it's not going to be real. On the nose, it's initially quite soft. You've got some marshmallow in there, not literally obviously, it's not hot chocolate. So I'm getting notes of marshmallow. It was initially quite soft, however it became a little bit prickly. There's some lime zest in there. There's some vanilla, which is kind of a key component flavour of a grain whisky. And when I say that, I do not mean that they add vanilla flavouring. It is just a characteristic that grain whisky tends to have. It carries, alongside those bourbon casks, that also adds a vanilla note, whether it be smell or taste. It is still quite youthful, it's quite grainy. There's a little bit of creaminess in there. There's a definite cereal note. And again, it sounds obvious, but I mean, I'm talking things like maybe honey nut cornflakes or something. It's not overly complex, but it's not offensive. It's quite inoffensive, to be honest. On the palate, now the mouthfeel is very thin. That does not surprise me, because as well as being bottled at 40%, this whisky will have been chill filtered. Now, what chill filtration is, the whisky is chilled down considerably. It is then run through a series of filters. And what that does is it basically removes a lot of the oilier compounds within the spirit. Because sometimes when a whisky cools down, if you buy a bottle of whisky that's chill filtered, non-chill filtered, sorry, and you leave it somewhere cold and go back to it, sometimes it will go cloudy. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean the whisky's gone off. That is the fattier compounds within the whisky. And it's the same when you add water. If you add water to a whisky that's been non-chill filtered, sometimes it will again go cloudy, or you'll get little strands in there, or what look like strands, like little ribbons. Again, that's just the compounds. That's nothing wrong with the whisky. It's not going to make you ill. It's just the spirit. So what distillers tend to do, because they think that people don't like to see that sort of stuff, it puts consumers off, they chill the whisky down and run it through various filters, and that is called chill filtration. Now, for me, and for a lot of people, that removes a lot of flavour. It also removes a lot of texture, as you can imagine. It's basically like running olive oil through a coffee filter. It's going to do something to it. The keynote for me on the palate again is that vanilla from the nose. It's becoming a little bit fruity towards the finish, possibly some tart green apple in there. There is still a cereal note. I'm leaning more towards the corn again, possibly sweet corn this time rather than honey nut cornflakes. A little bit of spice, a little bit of citrus as well. Slightly creamy note to it. The finish, very, very short. Really not much to say on the finish, to be honest with you. I mean, again, I paid 16 quid for this. You can already see I've drunk about half the bottle. Is this the worst whiskey I've ever drunk? No, it's not. Is it the best whiskey I've ever drunk? No, it's not. Not by a long shot. Do I regret spending £16 on this? No, I don't. There's going to be quite a few people that I know that will probably take the mick out of me for saying that, because I've been drinking whiskey for over a decade now. And Haig Club has got a bit of a reputation about it because of its initial launch. So Haig Clubman is basically the cheaper, more widely available version of Haig Club. So Haig Club is the one in a similarly coloured bottle, but it's the wider bottle, thinner. And that's the one that released with David Beckham. Now, I'm a United fan, so I love Becks. However, I did think it was a bit weird when Diageo, who own this brand, massive drinks company, own Guinness, own the majority of whisky distilleries in Scotland, when they brought Beckham in. But it's been aimed at a market of potentially people that haven't drunk whisky before. If you're here watching this for the first time after buying this, chances are this is one of your first whiskies, and there's nothing wrong with that. I've gladly mixed this with ginger ale this weekend, and it's fantastic on a hot summer's day. Grain whisky, it's a little bit, vanilla led, like I've said. It's got a bit of citrus in there, it's quite creamy. It's lovely with ginger ale, it's really nice. It's not an overly complex whisky. This is not the sort of whisky you're going to be sitting down with on a cold night in winter and analysing and taking an hour with it. This is for mixing, this is just for not thinking about. And sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. So yeah, it's not fantastic, but I'm also don't regret spending 16 quid on it either. There's worse out there. So guys, I'm going to box it off. See you soon.